Monica Hannon. Neuroscience is hot right now because there are few things in life more fascinating than the human brain. And today we're going to be talking with Dr. Ken Larson about some of the ways that the brain works. What makes us tick? You know, the brain is such a complicated thing. Can you start out by just telling us, you know, the structures of the brain? We don't really even understand what all is involved in the brain, right?
That's a good place to start. I think that it would be useful to insert a video here by Dr. Siegel. He has a clever way to explain the brain using his hand. Let's take a look.
One of the most rewarding experiences for me has been to study brain science and apply it to the experience of parenting. And the hand model of the brain that I use to teach parents is very useful to understand that. So if you take your thumb and put it in the middle of your palm, put your fingers over the top, this is a very useful model of the brain. And when we can actually see in front of us what's going on in the brain, then we can change what the brain does. So let me walk you through very basically what happens in this brain and the structures in it. And it goes like this. The spinal cord comes up, representing the wrist, and then you have coming up into the skull, the brain stem and the limbic area, which work together to help regulate arousal and your emotions and the way you have a fight, flight, freeze response. These are below the cortex, the limbic and brainstem areas, and the cortex is this higher part of the brain that allows us to perceive the outside world, to think and reason. And this frontmost part of the brain, right behind your forehead, so the person's oriented like this, is actually the part that regulates the subcortical, limbic, and brainstem areas.
I find that model very helpful to remember the different brain modules, so to speak, and how they function in our lives.
So are we looking at evolution here? I mean, from the primitive all the way up to the more complex?
Good observation. The brainstem, the most primitive brain module, is often referred to as the reptilian brain, suggesting that this part of the brain resides in animals all the way down to lizards and snakes. The midbrain, or the limbic regions, appear in mammals and begin the development of emotion and the ways that emotions affect behavior. The neocortex can be called the new brain because it appears to be the last module added. This layer manages our thinking and choosing functions, sometimes described as executive functions.
How does information get into the brain?
Primarily through our senses. Sight, touch, hearing, smelling, tasting. These are the ways that we gather information from outside ourselves and bring it inside so we can process it.
Well, there's a common belief that perception is reality. I know that's something that we hear a lot in the news business and in the news world. Would you say that that's true?
That's a nice philosophical question, which really boils down to how we define reality. Let me inject an image here that I think is important in any discussion such as this. Think of an old-fashioned mechanical slot machine. You can see a row of 3 images. You know that each image is just one small part of a larger wheel that holds many images. Only one image shows at a time. And if they are the right ones, you win a prize. The point here is that we are restricted to seeing only one image out of many. Our perceptions are like that. The information we take in from outside is limited to what we can see and experience with our senses. In the chart, we talk about the real world, which is all that exists whether we experience or not. As we described earlier, we experience the real world through our senses, which are then shaped by our experience, our learning, and our beliefs. These are represented in the total knowledge filter and the values filter. So what results is, from this sensory data, is our perception of what is outside of us. The tricky part is that this internal perceived world is more real to us than the real world, simply because that is the only way we know the real world. For example, I'm colorblind, and my kids used to ask me what it was like to be colorblind. I could only answer that I have not seen the world through any other eyes but my own, so all I know is the world as I see it. So in that sense, my perceptions are the reality that I use to guide me through life. The interesting part of this is that my perception may well be different from yours, which makes it a challenge to agree on what is reality.
Well, you know, we had talked earlier about how the brain works, and you had shown me a chart, very interesting, about the real world versus the perceived world. How does that compare those for me?
This is where we get into the fun stuff. Thinking people have long looked at the differences between sensations and perceptions. I think the choice theory chart is probably one of the best graphical metaphors I've seen to help us understand the process of going from gathering information through our senses and then processing that information so it becomes useful to us in our brain. So looking at the chart, we can see how the so-called real world exists out there. It exists whether we know it is there or not. Our sensory system contacts this real world and brings in information that is represented in the perceived world as some sort of symbolic representation of what the senses pick up. In other words, if I see a tree, that tree does not move into my brain. It's still outside, but I've formed something in my perceived world that represents that tree so I can think about it and talk about it and recognize it when I see it again. Notice on the chart how sensory information passes through the total knowledge filter, which enables me to recognize the tree because I've learned earlier about trees. The values filter then sort of gives a priority or level of importance to what I see as a tree. This values filter is attuned to my basic needs. If I'm skiing and see the tree, I'm going to give it a high value because I don't want to hit it. And this is driven by my basic need for survival. If I'm driving through a forest, I'm going to put a lesser value on seeing trees because they're just part of the background and have no direct effect on my basic needs at that time.
Okay, so I perceive something, and then what happens to my perception at that point?
By the time it becomes a perception, it has passed through your knowledge filter, so you have identified what you perceive. So, for an example, let's say you have seen a dog. You know it's a dog because you've seen dogs before and you know what they are. Then your values filter is quickly checked to see if this dog affects any of your basic needs. Because of your prior experience with dogs, your perception will either be positive, emotionally, neutral, emotionally, or fearful, emotionally.
So my reaction to that dog might be different from your reaction, right?
That's what is wonderful and difficult at the same time. Of course your perception of the dog is going to be different than mine. Your experience of encounters with dogs may have fit with your need for love or your need for fun, in which case your perception generates a positive emotional response. I may have been bitten by a dog as a child, therefore the dog is a potential threat, which impacts my survival need and generates a fearful, negative reaction.
What do you call that difference?
I would call it experience. We've both had a different experience of a dog. That experience is filed away in memory and is brought into our consciousness when we see a dog. This is an excellent illustration of why it is so important to first of all realize that each of us is unique in our experience of the world. Once we really recognize and acknowledge that uniqueness, we might not be so quick to disagree when someone's perceptions are not the same as mine.
All right. So when you're talking about the quality world, the thing that we want the most, how is what we perceive impacted? How does what we perceive impact the quality world for the individual?
Actually, it's probably the other way around. Our quality world pictures determine what we do with our perceptions. Let me digress briefly and describe the quality world and our basic needs. Choice theory names 5 basic needs that we seek to fulfill. These needs are love and belonging, freedom, fun, power, and survival. There's no hierarchy here. They're just Dr. Glasser talks about these needs. Each of us has a different strength of these needs. Some people have a higher fun need than others. Others have a higher freedom need than others. But when we talk about these needs, we're talking about these 5 basic needs. So our brain is the control system that moves us to fulfill these needs. Each of us has some sort of picture or internal representation of what meeting those needs would be like. Those pictures are contained within what choice theory describes as the quality world. This quality world is a subset of the perceived world. For instance, when I think of my need for fun, I may imagine sailing. You may imagine a day at the races. Each of us has some internal sense of what would fulfill that need and the other needs. Your question then is how our perceptions impact the quality world. Primarily, these perceptions are an indicator of how close the present situation is to getting our needs met or keeping us from getting those needs met. These needs are usually experienced by an awareness of what we want. I've sometimes heard speakers distinguish between wants and needs. For me, in this discussion, our wants are an expression of our needs and not something separate or different.
Okay, now are everybody's basic needs the same?
That is an interesting question. I've found that it's helpful to think about human beings as being simultaneously unique, similar, and alike. Unique as persons, yet similar in some ways and alike in many ways. Each of us have a unique background of experiences that have shaped our character. At the same time, we're similar to others in our cultural group, in our social behavior, and we are alike in many ways biologically. When Dr. Glasser named the 5 basic needs, he didn't intend that this would be an exhaustive listing of all human needs. That list would be pretty long. These 5 needs are representative for most of us of what our brain strives to fulfill by our behavior. In a way, they are alike for all of us, yet each of us meets these needs in a different way. For example, you may fulfill your fun need by joining a skydiving club, while I may find my fun need by taking an adult education course at the local community college. In both cases, a need is being met, but with totally different choices. It's also important to realize that different people experience the intensity of these needs differently, as I mentioned earlier. This often shows up among couples where, for example, one partner has a strong need for love and belonging, and the other has a strong need for freedom. While one wants to be together all the time, the other has a need to break away from time to time. So unless this difference is recognized and negotiated, serious problems can result.
Okay. How does getting your basic needs met, affect your behavior?
This is right at the core of choice theory teaching. Choice theory maintains that all behavior is purposeful and directed towards getting our needs met in the best ways we know how. Some of the things we do to get our needs met are learned, and sometimes those things we've learned don't work well because of conflicts with the rest of the social culture that we are in. Or, more personally, because of conflicts within our close relationships. We can learn to modify our behavior by negotiating our differences in the ways we get our needs met. Dr. Glasser uses an idea that he calls the solving circle for helping couples work together to get their needs met. He asks the couple to imagine themselves within a sort of imaginary circle. He then asks them to realize that in that circle there are 3 entities. This usually triggers some questions about what is the third entity. The couples realize that there are the 2 of them in the circle, but what is this third entity? Dr. Glasser then helps them see that their relationship is in the circle with them. So the relationship is the third person. Then he helps them find ways of working together to serve the relationship, asking themselves, is what I'm doing bringing us closer or driving us apart? There's more on this solving circle available if you're interested.
Does this basic understanding help people who need therapy, for instance, get the right kind of therapy?
Any insight is helpful. The need for therapy usually emerges after some sort of crisis, often involving a close relationship. This often leads to the realization that what we are doing is not getting us what we want. If therapy helps the person learn more effective ways of getting needs met in relationships, then it's the right kind of therapy. When what we want is not what we are getting, then sometimes it's good to get some help.
Okay, well here's the big question. How do we know what we want?
That's one of those very deep questions that can take us from the superficial to the profound very quickly. One thing to consider is that our wants are usually a way of noticing our needs. When lonely, we want to be with a friend or loved one. When threatened, we want to find a safe place. When bored, we look for something that is fun. When feeling tied down and overcommitted, we want to take a break. When hungry, we want to eat. Within each of our wants, there is the opportunity for a choice. I think most of us are aware that there are choices that may meet our immediate needs, but interfere with long-term wants. A simple example would be wanting to get something to eat. The advertising industry skillfully entices us to supersize it, which may satisfy our immediate craving, but leads us away from a long-term want to have a fit and healthy body.
Can people fool themselves thinking they want one thing when actually what they really want is something else?
Sure. Wanting that sexy red convertible may reflect more than a desire for reliable transportation. The image of the car is directed towards getting us to think that having that car would meet another need, perhaps a need to be noticed or envied, or to find a date. The people that generate these ads understand the quality world pictures and are very skillful at working to move their product into that world. Our wants are usually driven by some internal image of a person, an object, or a belief system that represents the ways that we can meet our needs. These images are what choice theory calls our quality world pictures, and they reside in our quality world, which is part of our perceived world. As we actually achieve some of the things we want, we may find satisfaction, or we may discover that our desire was for something other than what we actually obtained. I suspect all of us in our growth toward maturity have experienced some disillusionment in this process. A good way to reflect on your question would be to do a mental dissection of the term disillusionment. It's simply a succinct way of saying that the reality of what I thought I wanted wasn't what I thought it would be.
Can you tell me about the comparing place?
The comparing place is where we check what is happening in our life with what we want to have happen. Our needs are what are behind what we want. If we are getting our needs met, we feel good. If we are not getting our needs met, we don't feel good. This metaphorical comparing place is where we compare what is happening with what we want. If we get a frustration signal telling us that a need or needs are not being satisfied, that generates a move towards some behavior to correct the situation.
How much are we influenced by early experiences?
Early experiences in life form the total knowledge filter and the values filter. As we've discussed earlier, these filters color and shape the information coming into us by way of our senses. So yes, we're strongly influenced by early experiences. What choice theory asks us to do is to realize that life exists now and not in the past. We can be aware of how the past has shaped our perceptions and thus our reality, but we cannot change the past. All we have is now.
Can we overcome things that maybe hold us back in life, even though we were perhaps patterned early?
Choice theory reminds us that early patterns have had an influence on who we are today. What Dr. Glasser also points out is that we cannot change the past. We can deal with what is going on right now in our lives, and that's about it. Most often, present difficulties center on a close relationship that's not working. Choice theory would focus attention on what needs to be done to repair that relationship. While it is important to recognize the effects of influences early in life that have affected adult behavior, the focus is on choices that can be made here and now. Therapeutic approaches that are helpful in reshaping present patterns of relating can help meet the need to be connected in the present. As present relationships start to work better, the effects of these early patterns are overcome. Choice theory works to steer clients away from unnecessary analysis of what happened back then. The only real life we have is what's happening now. It is in this now state that choice theory and reality therapy are helpful.
Okay. And how can we use this information to change our lives more specifically? I mean, I understand, you're telling me I understand what happened and that helps me to deal with it, but is there steps that you take, things that you can do to further that?
This is where it gets personal. My intention here is to present information that is of general interest. Its application to individuals is beyond the purpose of this discussion. Having said that, I would like to mention one particular area of study that I find intriguing, and that is the adult attachment interview and how it has been used therapeutically. This interview is being used to help determine attachment patterns in adults that are at least potentially problematic. As subjects with insecure attachment patterns are asked to describe their early childhood, the narrative is often a sort of Pollyanna tale of ideal relationships, or a confused, disjointed, poorly remembered story. Secure attachment backgrounds are characteristically well-remembered, smooth-flowing, coherent accounts of early family life. What I find intriguing is that if the insecurely attached subjects can get in touch with what really happened in their childhood, and can form a coherent narrative in the now that makes sense of even difficult traumatic relationships and childhood experiences, they can achieve a sort of acquired, secure approach to relationships that enables them to avoid passing on the insecure patterns of their own childhood to their children. I believe this is because they can see with some clarity the choices they can make now in the ways that they relate to their own past and the ways that they care for their children. My hope is that our audience will take the time to research this information about attachment theory more deeply than we can actually have time to present in this presentation. It's very helpful to understand our past, and again realizing that we can't change the past, but by understanding the past we can make the changes we need to make in the present.
But a lot of those things that happen to us early in life are painful, and we don't like to think about them, and in some cases even bury them. It's so painful. So what is it that would compel us to even bring that back up?
I assume your question is about why we would deliberately try to relive the past in some way. Most of us know that sometimes past painful memories intrude in our lives without our working to bring them up. There is an approach to psychotherapy that seems to hold that revisiting and reliving the past trauma that formed those painful memories can be therapeutic. The approach that makes the most sense to me is what I described earlier. If we determine that the past is intruding into our present, particularly interfering with an important relationship, we can work to make sense out of what happened in the past so that we can live freely in the present. We know we can't change the past. We can change the ways we perceive the past, however, which after all is what shapes our present experience. This is not trying to relive the past, it's working to make sense out of what has influenced us so we can make better choices in our present lives.
Well, Dr. Larson, what is it that you want your audience to know or understand from this conversation?
First of all, I want to emphasize again that our perceptions and memories are constructions, only partially formed by the external real world. We take what we are experiencing and construct a perception and then a memory built up of our present experience, linked with our past experiences and memories, and all this forms a symbolic mental image that is not a recording of experience but an internally built picture. If we have built our perceptions and memories from our own past, we can change the construction of perceptions and memories if we will be determined to be impartially honest in our evaluation of those past events that are shaping our present experience. We do this by realizing that the influence of the past is not a present reality, and we can sort of sidestep how those past memories are intruding into our present experience. If we can then make sense of the insights we have gained and narrate those insights in a coherent way to ourselves and others, we can have a new level of freedom in how we experience life. In other words, we can choose to be free of how our past has shaped the ways that we experience our life in the present. When we are experiencing the unpleasant feelings of unhappiness from not getting our needs met, I want to help people see that there are choices. These choices can be expressed fairly simply, recognizing that what is simple is not always easy. We can choose to change what we want, or we can change what we are doing to get what we want. Or both. Thank you, Monica.
All right, well, thanks very much. I learned a lot during this conversation, and I know that the rest of the audience did too.